The median American home now costs more than 6 times the median household income. That gap used to be closer to 3. Somewhere between then and now, the housing market divided into two completely different realities. On one side, homeowners watched their equity double. Values climbed, wealth compounded, and the market delivered everything it promised. On the other side, buyers who did everything right, saved, waited, fixed their credit, still cannot close. Same market. A radically different experience, entirely determined by which side of that ownership line you stand on. That split is not an accident. It is the design. That gap is not a temporary inconvenience caused by a bad stretch of interest rates or a few unusual years of inflation. What we are dealing with is more durable than a correction. The people who bought 15 or 20 years ago and held on are sitting on some of the largest single-asset gains in American financial history. The people trying to enter today face a price-to-income ratio that makes the mid-1990s look like a different country. When I say median home prices now exceed 6 times median household income, I am describing a national average. In coastal metros, in high-demand Sunbelt cities, in places where the jobs and the infrastructure exist, the ratio stretches much further. This is not a story of individual buyers failing to save enough. The math has structurally changed. Entonces cree derechostrachen yisheng non-spachan day, and the reason it changed is more complicated than any single headline will tell you. Most explanations focus on one variable at a time. Rates went up, inventory disappeared, builders stopped delivering enough product, inflation hit construction costs. Each of those is real. None of them is the complete answer. What sits underneath all of them is a convergence of financing mechanics, legal land use restrictions, tax structures, and political incentives that has spent decades building a wall between existing homeowners and everyone trying to join them. The boom you see on one side of that wall and the bust you feel on the other are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from two different positions in the same system. Start with the most visible piece: interest rates. When mortgage rates climbed from around 3% in 2021 to over 7% by 2023, the monthly payment impact was severe and immediate. Take a $350,000 home with 20% down. At 3% on a 30-year fixed mortgage, the principal and interest payment runs roughly $1,180 per month. At 7%, that same loan produces a payment closer to $1,863. That is nearly $700 more per month on the same house. The purchasing power of a typical buyer did not shrink modestly. It collapsed. That is real, and I'm not going to dismiss it. But rates alone do not explain what we are experiencing. In the early 1980s, 30-year mortgage rates peaked above 16%. People still bought homes. They qualified at those payments, negotiated prices that reflected the rate environment, and sellers adjusted. The reason that mechanism is not working the same way today comes down to what higher rates did to the supply side. When rates climbed after 2021, the buyers who suffered the most visible pain were the ones trying to enter. But there was a second group that rates affected in a completely different direction: existing sellers. According to data from Freddie Mac, the majority of outstanding mortgages in America carry rates below 4%. Many of those homeowners locked in at 2.5% or 3% during the historically low-rate window of 2020 and 2021. When you ask one of those homeowners to sell and buy again today, you are asking them to trade a payment they can comfortably afford for one that is significantly higher, on a house that itself costs more than the one they are leaving. Most of them say no, not out of stubbornness, but out of basic financial logic. The result is what analysts call the lock-in effect. Homes that would have entered the resale market under normal conditions are frozen. Homeowners with sub-4% mortgages are staying put. Inventory that should have cycled through is sitting still. And the buyers who can qualify at current rates are competing for a far smaller pool of available homes. Prices do not fall when sellers have no compelling reason to sell. Prices hold, and in many markets they have continued rising because the owners are not desperate. So rates hurt buyers twice. Once by raising the monthly cost, and a second time by removing the homes they would have purchased. That is why a rate cut alone cannot solve what we are dealing with. Even if rates dropped meaningfully tomorrow, the underlying shortage would remain, because the shortage was structural before rates ever moved. Which brings us to the builder argument. The version most people accept is straightforward. America underbuilt for roughly a decade after the 2008 housing crash. Demand eventually exceeded that reduced supply, and prices are elevated because we need more construction. Research from Freddie Mac and the National Association of Realtors has estimated the cumulative shortfall at somewhere between 3 and 5 million units, depending on methodology and time frame. That gap is real. The question is why it has not been filled. Builders are not charities. They build where the economics work, where permitting moves quickly, land is available at a price that still allows margin, and the finished home can sell at a price buyers can finance. The problem is that those conditions increasingly do not align with where buyers need homes most. Land in high-demand areas has become expensive on its own. Material and labor costs have risen substantially. Permitting fees, impact fees, and soft costs have added up across many markets. When all of that gets combined, a builder who starts a single-family home today in most major metros cannot deliver it at a price that any reasonable definition of affordable would recognize. Here is the number that gets lost in the builder conversation. The median price of newly constructed homes has in recent years exceeded the median price of existing homes. For most of American history, new construction was expected to cost more than older inventory. New appliances, modern layouts, warranties, but the gap has widened, and entry-level new construction has largely disappeared from the major markets where demand is concentrated. Builders are delivering for the move-up buyer, for the investor, for the person who already owns something to sell. The first-time buyer at the lower end of the income distribution is not profitable to serve in the current cost environment, and the market has responded accordingly. So we have rates that squeezed existing inventory through the lock-in effect, and builders who cannot profitably close the entry-level gap. Two substantial obstacles stacked together. But before I go deeper, I want to step back, because there is a pattern in these surface explanations that I think matters more than any individual variable. Every cause I have described, rates, underbuilding, the lock-in effect, disproportionately benefits people who already own property and disadvantages people trying to enter. Existing owners benefit from rising prices. The lock-in effect protects their low-rate position while removing inventory from buyers. The new construction gap means their resale homes face less competition from new supply. None of this required any single actor to plan it. But the alignment of outcomes is consistent enough that you have to ask why the system keeps producing the same result across decade after decade. Interest rates fluctuate, builders cycle in and out of markets, recessions hit, and yet the affordability gap for first-time buyers persists and generally widens. That persistence is the real signal. The consistent factor is not any individual variable. It is the structure the variables operate inside. That structure has a physical expression most people have never thought about, and it sits directly underneath every supply conversation. Zoning, specifically single-family only zoning, the legal designation that governs what can and cannot be built on the majority of residential land in most American cities. Research from the National Zoning Atlas has documented that in city after city, 75% or more of residential land is restricted to one home per lot. Apartment buildings are prohibited. Duplexes are prohibited on most parcels. The higher density housing that could allow more people to live near jobs and transit is simply illegal to build on most of the land where people want to live. This did not happen randomly. What urban planners call Euclidean zoning, named for a 1926 Supreme Court case, formalized the separation of land uses across American cities, and was then expanded aggressively during the post-World War II suburban build-out. Municipality after municipality adopted single-family zoning as the default, and over the following decades, that default calcified into something closer to a permanent restriction. The result is that the supply problem is not primarily a question of whether builders want to build. It is a question of whether building is legally permitted where it would matter most. A small number of cities have started changing this. Minneapolis voted to eliminate single-family only zoning citywide through its 2040 comprehensive plan. Austin significantly loosened restrictions on accessory dwelling units and reduced parking minimums that were effectively capping density. Houston has famously operated without traditional Euclidean zoning at all. Rezoning alone does not produce overnight affordability. The relationship between policy change and price response takes time and depends on other factors. But the directional evidence from markets that have actually loosened supply restrictions is instructive. In the cities where restrictions have stayed intact, the political maintenance mechanism is NIMBYism. Existing homeowners voting against density, opposing new apartment buildings, raising concerns about parking and school capacity and neighborhood character. Those concerns are sometimes legitimate on their own terms, but the underlying financial reality is that restricting supply in a high-demand area protects existing property values. Opposing new construction is, in part, a financial strategy by another name. And the buyer searching for an entry-level home in a supply-restricted major metro is not just competing against other buyers. They are competing against a legal framework that prevents the supply they need from being built in the first place. Now, I want to address something that generates considerable heat in this conversation because it deserves an honest accounting rather than an oversimplified verdict. Over the past decade, institutional investors, large corporations, and real estate investment trusts have purchased substantial numbers of single-family homes in American markets and converted them into long-term rentals. Companies like Invitation Homes and American Homes 4 Rent have built portfolios of tens of thousands of properties, concentrated in Sunbelt metros and mid-tier cities where prices were accessible after the 2008 crash. How much are they actually responsible for the affordability problem? Institutional investors account for somewhere between 3 and 5% of single-family home purchases nationally, depending on the time period and methodology used. In specific zip codes, that concentration is higher. Their market behavior is disproportionate to their raw market share because they operate as cash buyers, move quickly, and set a price floor in markets where first-time buyers tend to be most active. That behavior reduces sellers' incentive to negotiate with financed buyers. But 3 to 5% nationally is not what drives a 6-to-1 price-to-income ratio. What matters more about the institutional story is what it reveals about the broader transformation of housing as a category. After 2008, housing stopped being primarily understood as shelter and became widely understood across individual homeowners, not just Wall Street companies, as the primary investment vehicle for American middle-class wealth. When your home is your retirement account, you do not favor policies that could reduce its value. You vote against them. You attend the zoning meetings to oppose the new apartment building. The financialization of housing is not primarily a corporate story. It is a cultural and political story that extends to tens of millions of individual homeowners. Short-term rentals have added a related dimension in specific markets. In tourist-driven communities, coastal towns, and amenity-rich destinations, a meaningful fraction of housing has been redirected from long-term residential use to nightly vacation rentals. The home that might have housed a local family is generating nightly income for its owner instead. This is not a national driver of unaffordability, but in the specific markets where it has concentrated, it has measurably reduced the long-term residential supply available to working residents. The pattern across all of these forces, institutional demand, individual homeowner psychology, short-term rentals, zoning restrictions, is consistent. Housing is being pulled toward investment and away from shelter. When those two purposes compete for the same stock of properties, the investment logic consistently wins. Investment buyers can pay more, move faster, and sustain holding costs that residential buyers using conventional financing cannot match. Take a step back and look at what all of the causes we have discussed actually share. Rates lock existing owners in place. Zoning prevents new supply in the locations where demand is strongest. Construction economics push builders away from entry-level product. Tax structures reward holding over selling. Investment demand competes directly against first-time buyers. Every one of these factors operates in the same direction. It rewards ownership and penalizes entry. And they compound because the political structure of American homeownership was built to reward existing owners in ways that have grown progressively harder to change. The mortgage interest deduction allows homeowners to deduct mortgage interest from taxable income. It sounds broadly helpful, but the benefit is concentrated in high-income earners with large loans. A first-time buyer with a modest mortgage, especially after the expansion of the standard deduction in 2017, often receives little or no practical benefit from this provision. What was sold as a homeownership incentive functions primarily as a subsidy to people wealthy enough to own expensive homes. The capital gains exclusion allows a married couple to exclude up to $500,000 in home sale profits from federal income tax. This represents a genuine policy choice to reward long-term ownership. It also concentrates wealth gains in homeowners and creates no corresponding benefit for the renter trying to accumulate a down payment. The most structurally distorting mechanism operates at the property tax level. California's Proposition 13, passed in 1978, caps annual property tax increases at 2%, regardless of actual market appreciation. A homeowner who bought in a major California city in 1985 may be paying property taxes based on an assessed value that has no relationship to what the home is worth today. A new buyer in the same neighborhood pays taxes on the current market price. That two-tier structure within the same community gives longtime owners a powerful financial incentive to stay. Not because they love the house, but because leaving means losing a tax advantage that has compounded across decades. Similar assessment cap mechanisms exist in other states. The effect is consistent. It rewards people who are already in and discourages the turnover that would release inventory to new buyers. The political machinery that maintains all of this is straightforward. Homeowners are the most reliable voters in local elections. The school boards, city councils, and zoning boards that control housing supply. Renters and prospective buyers move more frequently, vote in local elections at lower rates, and have less organized political leverage over the decisions that most directly affect their housing options. The outcome is a system that reliably produces results favorable to existing owners. Not because anyone planned it that way as a whole, but because the incentive structure at every decision point points in that direction. If you are finding this useful and want me to continue digging into specific markets and situations, subscribe. This channel exists because too many real estate videos stop at the surface, and the answers that actually matter are always one layer deeper. Here is what I have been building toward, and it is the piece that explains why the market will not self-correct through any single policy change or rate adjustment. The lock-in effect I described earlier is real, but the actual lock-in is broader and deeper than a rate story. It is an exit problem. At every level of the ownership chain, in every category of potential seller, the system has constructed financial incentives to hold rather than to release. The retiree who has owned a 4-bedroom home for 30 years would genuinely prefer to downsize. The maintenance is excessive. Her adult children are elsewhere, but if she sells, she loses whatever property tax protection her state provides and resets to current market rates on whatever she purchases next. She may face a capital gains tax event if her appreciation exceeds the exclusion limit. She then enters the same inventory shortage she is leaving, competing for a smaller home in the same constrained market at today's prices. The financial math tells her to stay, so she stays. The 4-bedroom home does not enter the market. The couple who bought a starter home in 2020 at a 3% rate would sell and buy larger. They have 2 children now and need the space. But the payment on a larger home at current rates would be substantially higher even at a similar price point. And larger homes are more expensive than they were when the couple bought. The financial penalty for moving up is immediate and painful. So they stay. The starter home does not enter the market. The investor who purchased several single-family homes in 2021 might consider selling in a challenging rent environment, but selling could mean realizing a loss or triggering taxes on gains. Holding allows depreciation schedules to continue working in their favor. Holding is the rational decision. The properties stay off the market. At every tier, at every stage of ownership, the incentive is to hold. This is not greed or irrationality. It is individual actors responding logically to a system that rewards holding and penalizes exit. The cumulative result is a market frozen simultaneously at the top and at the entry point. Nobody is releasing inventory. The homes younger buyers need are occupied by people who have every rational financial reason to stay in them indefinitely. The demographic consequence of this compounds quietly. When you delay homeownership by 5, 8, 10 years, you are not simply postponing a purchase. You are shrinking the compounding window in the asset class that has historically been the primary vehicle for middle-class wealth accumulation in America. A buyer who enters at 32 has decades of equity growth ahead. A buyer locked out until 42 has lost 10 years of that compounding at precisely the age when it would matter most. This is not a temporary hardship that resolves when rates normalize. It is a generational wealth divergence that builds year by year and does not reverse. A system assembled over decades through overlapping policy decisions, tax structures, zoning laws, and political incentives cannot be dismantled by a single rate cut or one city's rezoning vote. The political actors who could change it would have to vote against the immediate financial interests of their most reliable constituent base. Homeowners dominate local elections and shape the zoning boards that control supply. The people who would benefit most from reform participate in local politics at lower rates and with less organized influence. That is the honest answer to why the system persists, despite the visible harm it causes. What you can actually control in this environment is narrower than you have probably been told. You cannot change the rate environment through financial discipline. You cannot reform zoning in your target city by improving your credit score. You cannot reduce institutional demand by saving a larger down payment. These are structural realities, and pretending they can be navigated around individually is a disservice to buyers who are genuinely trying to figure out what to do next. What you can control is geography. Affordability still exists in America, but it is not where most buyers are currently looking. Secondary Midwest cities, markets like Columbus, Indianapolis, Kansas City, and Omaha, continue to show price-to-income ratios meaningfully more manageable than coastal or major Sunbelt metros. Mid-sized southern markets before they attract heavy institutional concentration. Appalachian communities with genuine infrastructure and employment bases. These are not consolation prizes. In many cases, they offer a stronger quality of life per dollar of housing cost than the high-profile markets most buyers target. What you can also control is your working assumption about timing. Waiting for rates to return to 3% is not a strategy. It is a bet that the conditions that produce the 2021 price run-up will return without producing a second one. When rates were at 3%, competition eliminated negotiating leverage, produced waived inspections, and drove prices to the peaks buyers today find out of reach. Lower rates restore competition. They do not automatically restore affordability because the structural supply shortage persists regardless of what the rate environment does. Tell me in the comments what market you are currently trying to buy in and what your biggest obstacle is. The range of situations across different cities and states is significant, and it directly shapes what I dig into next. Return to the image in front of you. The split between boom and bust. The luxury home, the rising equity, the wealth on one side. The abandoned structure, the locked door, the market that no longer functions as a point of entry on the other. Those two images are not opposites. They are cause and effect. The boom produced the bust. The wealth on one side was built through the same structural decisions that created the barrier on the other. Rising prices serve existing owners. Restricted supply serves them. Tax policy serves them. At every decision point, the system chose the side that already had the most to gain. The median home costing more than 6 times the median income is not a market failure. It is a market performing exactly as the underlying structure was built to produce. Understanding that will not lower your payment this week. But the buyer who understands the system, who stops waiting for it to self-correct and starts asking where the math still works, is in a fundamentally different position than the buyer still expecting normal. This market has a design. Now you know what it is.